What I would like to contribute this evening is, from my limited university perspective, finally something about the scientific basis of why this works, because it is a gift that lies within each and every one of us. And what I also noticed about myself, what blocked me the most, was my own disbelief. The self-doubt was a loud conviction from school onwards that something like that wasn't possible, that it went against the world view. It's like negative hypnosis, and tonight I would like to make a small contribution to simply reversing this negative hypnosis caused by malformation by working with exactly those, I almost said weapons, that we almost turn against ourselves. So I just want to correct wrong thinking by thinking correctly. In the 20th century, two super monks, Paisios and Porphyrios, lived on the Greek monastery on the Athos Peninsula in Greece. One died in 1991 and the other in 1994, and both healed people with the most serious illnesses and paralysis through prayer, cancer, other ailments immediately on the spot. One, Porphyrios, as a young man, had damaged himself so much through asceticism that he then had to go to the more temperate climate on the mainland in Athens. And the nice thing is, he worked as a hospital chaplain at an Athena Pulik clinic. He worked with doctors and treated patients, were sent to him by the doctors, some with x-rays, metastases in the lungs. He prayed for those who were x-rayed and healed. When I found out about it, my first reaction was, no, it can't be. Because neither Die Site reported on it, nor Tagesthemen Special, nor Today Journal, so it doesn't exist. Until I realized that maybe my attention had just been directed in the wrong direction, because I hadn't heard of people like Daskalos who could materialize things. So briefly, I noticed that my view of the world is shaped by news broadcasts, by the leading media, which I trust, that the most important knowledge is of course the latest. My attention had obviously been drawn by news magazines, largely until then to anything that made me pessimistic about humanity. Crazy, violent criminals, assassins, natural disasters, but not mental healers. Researchers working on the topics say that current Western scientists, for one thing, don't know the basics of how all this stuff actually works. And the second thing is that when Western researchers publish some of these results in specialist journals, Nature, or even now in conventional US medical journals, when such results appear, and there is skepticism about them, they are still rejected according to the motto, there must be statistical or methodological ones be a mistake. Even if statistics professors have verified that this is true, it is still rejected. It's so frightening that the 300-year-old Western worldview that scientists are still trained with, when it is questioned, is a huge source of fear. What comes next? So essentially it's about fear preventing the new and preventing us from tapping into this potential within us. In my first lecture, Mental Healing Basics, I tried to describe as closely as possible the fact that I was now trying to place healing in the context of placebo research, in the context of Bruce Lipton and others. Now in part 2 of the lecture I will try to present a lot of direct studies, which one would say belongs in the area of PSI, but which are closely connected to the topic of healers and our powers, and I would also like to address worldview topics at the end. Who are we? What is the world like then? Interestingly, I always start my literature research neutrally, but interestingly enough, because of my research for this lecture, I unfortunately ended up not with theologians or with monks who may have written their dissertation about it, but where did I end up? The most important research on mental healing and these superpowers within us comes from government agencies, military and intelligence agencies. So it's clear that what I'm telling you here is really just crumbs. At least the crumbs also make you curious about the potential, which probably belongs to the unnamed area. The conclusion of the researchers who worked for these authorities is that the spiritual traditions tell us the truth. So these researchers are often tasked with researching these old yoga talents of a little levitation or PK, i.e. psychokinesis and such research, such superpowers. And they simply draw a conclusion and say, yes, we have been able to confirm this in the laboratory. It is also worldwide. This has also been confirmed by the Russians, for example, because they also have their own military. And when these researchers leave here in peace, they have a great network, and from then on, they can write some books. Which researchers are these? It's important to name names. One is Russell Targ, now retired. He was a physicist at Stanford University, so it's not somewhere, as you would say, yes, it's esoteric. As a physicist, he was one of NASA's leading engineers in the field of laser technology. For 20 years, he was a senior scientist and project manager at Lockheed Missiles and Space Company. And in 1972, he came to the Stanford Research Institute. That sounds boring now, but when you hear what research he did, a lot of his research, I'll quote, he of course described a lot of books. 10 years later, after he helped set up these Stanford Research Institutes, he says the program had become increasingly secret and operational, and I was no longer allowed to publish anything in the public literature. So these are just parts, and later this institute, the research doesn't stop, it is simply transferred somewhere else, taken over by a defense company, Science Application International Corporation, a conglomerate of research with applied sciences, NASA, armaments, applied sciences, and he says that what he had started with the Stanford Research Institute was greatly expanded in scope so that many other research institutions were also involved. When Targ began research in 1972, it was a $20 million program. It ran for 23 years. He himself says it was launched during the Cold War and supported by the CIA, NASA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Army and Air Force Intelligence Services, and many other government agencies. So, thankfully we have arrived at the most important scientific mystic researchers. Targ then also fought for the release of some data, which is also documented in the book. We can be grateful to him for that. One area that he was later allowed to write about was remote viewing. That was of course important for espionage. If you can see people see things in the distance, you can put that to good use. Not only to find kidnapped hostages and how their health is, but also pilots who have crashed, but also weapons factories with the Russians in Siberia and the like. He then also trained Russell Targ, a remote observer for the army, but also for a secret service. And one of Russell Targ's most important students was Joseph McMonigle. Targ also says that he was trained from 1978 to become PSI Agent 001 for the US Secret Services. This originally happened within the top-secret military project Stargate at the Stanford Research Institute. So now Russell Targ is retired. The literature then leads us to Dr. Dean Radin. I haven't found out exactly what he's doing now, but at least it's said that in addition to his academic work at Princeton University, he works for the American government. It probably won't be the Department of Education, and, among other things, he is the first to conduct long-term scientific studies to research the hidden powers of humans as they were described 2,000 years ago in the mysterious Yoga Sutras. So great, like me, none of the monks are being researched for American government agencies and defense companies. I find it all the more humorous how Bible texts are interpreted in the Protestant and Catholic churches today. When it says that Jesus knew what was going on in the Pharisees' heads, no, it's just meant symbolically, or that he healed people. No, that's not possible. If you say now they would rather join the military, well, as I said, Russell Targ has written a lot of books where we can assume, it's very impressive when I read them, what is there openly, if you then think about what probably hasn't been written there. But also published articles, for example, in the magazine Nature, and, as mentioned, trained teachers for the army. Now first the example, I then also get closer to the phenomenon of healing, but so that you see that what is otherwise no longer supported by the church. Russell Targ says, As part of our work for the CIA program in Menlo Park, California, for example, our viewers, i.e. these remote observers, were able to see a crashed Russian bomber. While they were sitting there, the bomber was now somewhere else. Find bomber pilots in Africa. The viewers he trained, were able to describe the health of American hostages in Iran and track down a kidnapped American general in Italy. We described so-called weapons factories in Siberia, a Chinese atomic bomb test 3 days before it was detonated. They then said that it would go wrong and what would go wrong, and we did countless other amazing things. Everything using the skills, especially that our colleague Ingo Svan taught us under the catchy name remote viewing. Ingo Svan was a New York artist, and of course they say people who don't always think analytically but are more emotional. Of course, holistic perception is better suited to begin with. The Joseph McMahon Eagle, who was then also trained by Tag at the Institute, Satch Tag described the secret construction of a 100 secret construction, a 170-meter-long Soviet Typhoon-class submarine in Russia. For his outstanding intelligence service, he received the Army's Legion of Merit. So it's not made up, it's real politics. Now, this institute by Russell Targ, which has been published, he also summarizes the state of research on various skills. Let's first start with the topic of mental influence from a distance, mind control. Targ says remote hypnosis has been studied in Russian laboratories since the early 20th century. In the 20s and 30s of the 20th century, the Russian physiologist and professor at the University of Leningrad, Leonid Vassiliev, carried out hundreds of hypnosis experiments with the direct support of Stalin. That may seem boring or even harmless, but it was a matter of remote hypnosis, where the other person didn't even know what and when and for how long they were being hypnotized and with what content. Vassiliev researched the wordless initiation of hypnosis, which was often carried out at a great distance from the hypnotized person. Some of them have been properly electromagnetically shielded, and the rooms have even been sealed with mercury, which is not so good for health, says Targ. And then he also carried out some telepathy experiments, as did the Americans back in the 1930s, J.B. Rhine from Duke University. Even then, the topic was, can one person's thoughts, brain waves, or even physical characteristics remotely influence another? So you notice how this is now slowly drawing attention to the topic of mental healing, and Targ says that's definitely possible. So when he says, if I imagine ice cream in the cone, maybe they have a vague image of something conical in their minds, maybe they even feel something like ice cream. What was a bit nastier was trying to see whether you could, for example, inflict pain on someone from a distance. Targ reports, perhaps not coincidentally, not about American experiments, but only about evil Russians. So let's get back to Vassiliev's research and the Leningrad ones. In the last century, the infliction of pain and the manipulation of behavior from a distance occupied an important place in official Soviet PSI research. One of Vassiliev's most famous experiments was conducted between Leningrad and Sevastopol. That's a distance of 1,600 kilometers. What here could reliably put a person to sleep and reliably wake them up again over a distance without anything being said to them. Then, from 1965 onwards, such programs were again heavily promoted on extrasensory perception, i.e. distance perception, but also on the subject of biological influences from a distance. This includes, for example, sending feelings, and the whole thing becomes a bit brutal. Namely, an attempt was made to suffocate someone from a distance, for example. These experiments now took place between Moscow and Leningrad. That's a distance of around 800 kilometers. Kamensky and his friend Nikolaev are now two very gifted sensitives. They were now both the test subjects. Kamensky was now sitting in the Moscow laboratory at the EEG, where you have measuring electrons in the brain and measure the currents. And his friend Nikolaev was also working on the EEG in Leningrad, and he should send him feelings. Targ has now found out more details about these experiments through a scientific friend and says, I would rather quote them, otherwise I wouldn't be able to invent it. Here it was. Targ says, Larissa told me that during one experiment, Kamensky conveyed the feeling of extreme pain, and in another, he even imagined himself strangling his friend. Remotely suffocating his friend Nikolaev was so successful that doctors in Leningrad monitoring changes in Nikolaev's EEG and pulse worried he might actually die. So they stopped the experiment. Healing and inflicting harm use the same powers in one way, of course, to be beneficial, and in the other, to be detrimental. Let's move on to something, in quotes, more innocuous attempts. For example, we have tried the perception when I constantly see something flashing in front of my eyes by chance. If I concentrate on another person, I can, for example, transfer the perception of flashing lights to that person. Both Nikolaev and Kamensky, the two with the feeling of being, also did this, sending pain and suffocation. The difference between flash and non-flash was clearly detectable via EEG and immediately in the first single curve. So you didn't have to let X more time pass and look. Is there perhaps a small signal that indicates that perhaps something was seen, subliminally and flashingly? Of course, Targ also tried to replicate such experiments at his institute, the Stanford Research Institute, and it worked. What Targ draws attention to in all of these experiments is that there is a big difference whether I take someone from the population or someone who has trained their attention. So someone with strong concentration, someone who is able to limit their mental noise, this very mental activity a bit, and just be there in an open presence instead of somehow dealing with a problem in the past or future. Let's try something nicer. This time I'm going to Dean Radin. He published a book, Supernormal, and his latest is Real Magic, published for the first time in English. Dean Radin also has a Facebook page where he points out which specialist articles he has published. I almost said I was allowed to appear. And Dean Radin is the current, in my opinion, very important researcher in this area. Maybe you remember that there was once a time when there was transcendental meditation. They're the ones who say you can levitate a bit too, these city flyers. But they always said something about changing world consciousness. They always said that if people meditate for peace in a place, it could, for example, reduce the crime rate in a city, which was called the Dhamma-Harishi effect. And they actually wanted to initiate this throughout the world. I found it exciting that Radin addresses this question of the extent to which meditators can actually change something purely through consciousness, without us now engaging in propaganda or distributing loans. Again, don't take it so lightly when, for example, you have people who do something black marginal. They can, of course, have exactly the opposite effect. But that's not in the books now. So there was actually a study initiated by the people of Transcendental Meditation that was carried out, the experiment in Juneau, July 1993. The question was whether meditators can reduce the number of violent crimes in Washington, the C-sect. So now it's not a government agency, it's the TM people who did it. This study was published in 1999 in the prestigious journal Social Indicators Research. And the violent crimes, now the way the study is structured, these are often questions. Are there mistakes? Violent crimes were measured using the standard police report. For a control comparison, data from the same reports for the same months were used, namely 5 years, 1988 to 1992. Variables that are known to have an influence on violent criminals were also taken into account, namely what the weather is like or what new crime-fighting measures are in place. The police and the citizens hung up. Have there been previous fluctuations in the region? how has the crime rate developed in neighboring areas. So it was very, very solidly built, and the scientists who then analyzed the data actually measured a highly significant decrease in crime rates. The largest decrease was 23.3% fewer crimes compared to the same period last year. So the basic question here is whether attention that is collectively focused on a topic can now carry people along without there being verbal communication. And so perhaps you'll better understand why I'm hugely skeptical of news broadcasts. It's like a church ritual. People expect disaster. They expect the bad. It's like a satanic mass, you could almost say. And of course, if there were just a 15-minute television program every evening that instructs people, now in the city or in the region, to concentrate on universal love, to first feel it within themselves and now to extend it to the region, that would be effective. For a long time it was thought that this would be of no use, but military studies have now proven it. And this Maharshi study, of course they say this is a religious community that perhaps wants to influence other evil people. This has also been tried under secular conditions, where someone or a group simply sends out goodwill. So you have recreated it, and so it is said that there are also completely independent experiments that show similar effects, so now imitate it. The next question was, can you influence someone with a picture? So if someone just looks at a person in the video, it will have an effect on the person in the video at the same time. The effect is known and measured. Someone feels that they are being looked at. They then measure this, for example, on the skin conductive resistance. In research, this is called distant intentionality, and Dean Radin says this image influencing has been successfully repeated around 50 times in laboratories around the world. In one variant, for example, a test subject tries to activate or calm the nervous system of a second isolated person who is physically distant. In this research design, the so-called sender looks at a video image from the so-called receiver, and the person being viewed at a distance does not know when the viewing phases take place and how long they last, but it has been proven that it works. But this also works, for example, with animals in the laboratory, whether gerbils are now becoming lazier or are really gaining weight on their wheels. Before I turn to the topic of healing again, I'll add one more thing. These were biological systems. Does this also work with technology? Again from Russell Targ. At the very beginning of the work of this Stanford Research Institute, they worked with the very talented artist Ingo Sven. He was able to concentrate very well and had fun trying out his technical gifts. I now quote again from Russell Targ so that everything is reproduced very accurately. He says, in 1972, Ingo Sven was able to measure the temperature on thermostors. As a woman, that's not my area of expertise, but luckily it says here that these are contactless heat sensors. So this gifted meditator could raise the temperature at thermostors in distant thermos bottles, and if he wanted, lower it too. These experiments were carried out at the City College of New York by Professor Gert Ruder Schmeitler. That was of course exciting for the people at the Stanford Research Institute, and they have now carried out a nicer experiment. In this attempt, Ingo manages to paranormally influence the functions of an almost perfectly shielded superconducting magnetometer, and this magnetometer was locked in the in-ground chamber beneath the Varian House of Physics at Stanford University. He could describe this magnetometer, and he could also disrupt it. Apparently Sven could record the frequency of the sine curve, which is the random rate of a magnetic field, and the whole thing was set up in the magnetometer. He could increase and decrease this sinusoid. So he was able to influence a system that had previously been running absolutely trouble-free and stable until he turned his laser-like attention to it. At Stanford, however, no one was happy about this attempt. And this incident gave rise to the first of numerous investigations. What are you doing at the Institute? namely through government agencies. Of course, M. Russell Targ says that he was included later, for example in 1987, in a series of 4 experiments on various laser and particle beam systems, microwaves and particle beam weapons. But we don't want to look at that in detail right now, so let's now move on to the area of healing. So it seems friendlier that they also tried out at these institutes, for example, as a Buddhist meditation practice suggests, sending with feeling to another person who is distant, whether that affects that person physically and emotionally. Dean Radin calls it a love study, and I describe another experiment with Russell Targ. This experiment then involved trying to remotely change someone's blood pressure and state of relaxation. The state of relaxation was measured by the change in electrical skin resistance, Gerwenic skin response, galvanic skin reaction. Again, as I already mentioned, you could increase the activity rate of gerbils on a running wheel, but you could also influence the spontaneous swimming direction of a small knifefish. These are strange fish that use an electrical organ for orientation. All of these experiments to investigate the mental influence of fairies were successful and, above all, repeatable. That's always the argument. Oh, yes, someone here was spontaneously healed, but that only has anecdotic evidence. Now, Targ describes another exciting experiment. Otherwise, you could always say it's somehow a placebo. There was an experiment here that was supposed to save endangered red blood cells that were in a test tube. In the other experiments with living systems, you can say that, in the scientific sense, consciousness is even inside a goldfish. But what about blood cells? The test subjects were asked in the laboratory to apparently influence something that was not conscious. In these tests, the blood cells were placed in test tubes with distilled water, and that is nasty for them because there is now a lack of salt. This is toxic for them. And if the salt content is too different than in the blood plasma, then the cell walls, weakness of the cell unit leaks into the solution. This is called hemolysis. And this hemolysis is easy to measure because the light transmission is lower when the blood cells are still intact, and more light comes through when they have dissolved. You now had 32 test subjects, and each person now had to process 20 blood tubes, which actually means only 10, and the other 10 were control tubes that were not influenced. So each person should now save 10 tubes of blood plasma. And it was found that all test subjects were significant, i.e., demonstrably able to protect the tubes and thus slow down the process of hemolysis. So it even works with blood cells in a test tube. Another study, now that it's directly about distance healing, is an AIDS study by Fred Siecher and Elizabeth Tank, which was published in 1998 in a conventional medical journal in the Western Journal of Medicine. It was performed at California Pacific Medical Center on men with advanced AIDS. So scientists will now say, yes, this meets standards. They are 2 separate randomized double-blind studies. All pairs have now been put together according to characteristics: old number of T cells, number of their AIDS typical diseases, and so forth. I'll shorten this now. It was proven that the men who were suffering from AIDS and for whom a distance healing intention was now sent, but by really trained distance healers, that they hardly had to go for treatment and the like. It is working, and Targ is now also taking a position, excitingly enough, because people keep saying that training has now been provided for 900 heart patients, but with little effect. Day was even there once when someone publicly presented the idea of such a study, and then Targ said yes, and who are they going to use as a healer now? We now want to take average people out of the population. Then Targ says they need experienced healers if they want to prove something. At our institute, we only work with healers who can demonstrate successful practice for at least 10 years. And he says that this should also reflect the average population. When you keep hearing about studies where there is hardly anything proven, always look who is working here. Because otherwise I could also prove it. So if I were to be used as an effect for mathematical school education, so to speak, I would say that I was never really interested, and then I would drastically falsify your statistics. What I'm leaving out now are things that are a bit tricky, i.e. PK, psychokinesis. Of course she was interested in both Targ and speaking, and there were also various meetings. They couldn't really do it intentionally, but sometimes it happened by accident, when they were just concentrating on other spoon benders while still holding their spoon in their hands. They accidentally succeeded. In a nutshell, that was an evening intended as a reading tip, the Red and Barussel Day. Waste products from Secret Service and armaments research that show what powers are within us. Now, I come to the second part. What does this say for our worldview? I found it exciting now, such scientists serving government agencies. How do they summarize this with the worldview? Because they can't just say, yes, everything is swinging anyway. How do they rephrase that? Of course, Targ and Radin also ask themselves, why don't such research results change our view of the world? So, for example, Russell Targ also says that the work of his entire institute is again, I think, in 1995. The CIA gave the order again. To what extent are the studies from the Stanford Research Institute really scientifically valid? So if a skeptic were to come along and say yes, it's not just about the research approach, or is there perhaps something wrong, or are there statistical deficiencies, and they have appointed one of the best-known scientific skeptics to test, and again a very renowned statistics professor in the USA, that she looked at all of these studies again and both said no, it really corresponds to scientific standards, and the effectiveness of these effects is sometimes better proven than the effectiveness of aspirin 100. So, there's no doubt why this doesn't change the worldview, and both say on the one hand, while this research is actually hardly noticed, both then also quote Max Planck about quantum theory. Planck says that a new scientific truth does not take off because its opponents are convinced, or because it makes it clear, but rather because its opponents will eventually die out, and a new generation will grow up that is familiar with the new theory. Targ then summarizes the new worldview, which in his view has been proven as follows. Consciousness is causal. Physical reality, here chairs, rooms, our physical bodies are the manifestation of consciousness. Furthermore, all consciousnesses are independent, whether we sit here or separately or live in another city. All consciousnesses, regardless of their physical manifestation, are part of a network of life. Not only do they inform and influence the network, but each and every one of us is also influenced by the network. So if we remember again that crime rate in Washington, D.C., of course this also works in a negative way when mass consciousness is now only directed towards catastrophes, fear, feelings of struggle for survival or competition, because it is incredibly difficult to live the actual potential of peace, love, and compassionate kindness in such a network. And this makes it clear why monks actually always form communities, and at least sometimes try to withdraw spatially and then use the supporting forces of nature, be it in the mountains or in long-distance forests. So, the first was consciousness is causal, and what we physically see is an expression of consciousness. The second, all consciousnesses are interconnected. Third, some aspects of consciousness are not limited to the space-time continuum. I had to leave that out today, this foreknowledge of events. And Russell Targ even talks about the phenomenon of retrocausality. So if I have a dream that warns me, I can change what would actually happen to me in the future. Russell Targ says the evidence suggests that we are actually non-local consciousness as humans, manifesting as a physical body in non-local space-time for a few years. And Max Planck, who is often quoted by both of them, said in 1931, "I look at consciousness as I look at matter as a derivative, i.e. something derived consciousness. We can't think of everything behind consciousness. We speak everything we consider to exist is postulated conscious." Radin then represents a worldview. At least from his point of view, there is a lot to be said for it. He looks at it. We have idealism, we have materialism, we have dualism, we have dualism. Materialism, i.e. everything is matter, even if you have feelings, then that is just a reflex of brain chemistry. Idealism, everything is consciousness. Dualism is, oh, we are here on earth and somewhere there is heaven, which is completely different. That's always the question. How do the two completely different systems come into interaction? And Radin says that speaks for him the most as a world with panpsychism, which he calls it. Panpsychism recognizes that mind and matter are quite real, but also represents the view that these elements of reality cannot be separated from each other and continue all the way down to the elementary particles, and even below, but also up into the universe and beyond. And Radin says we can see consciousness as the glue of what is real. He says that being conscious could be a fundamental force in the universe that connects and shapes how the universe then manifests itself. Like gravity, it is too weak to be noticed on small scales. It kind of lingers in the background. It is too alien to our normal view of the objective world for us to discover it, but it could be the glue that holds everything together and creates something instead of nothing. Even Joseph McMonigle, this remote viewer who then also solved beautiful government contracts in detail, ponders in his book Mind Track, what exactly is human beings? Who are we? And McMonigle has a near-death experience, and on the other hand, he was later able to travel through time through remote viewing. In one of his books, he describes that he was able to see how the Great Pyramid of Giza was built, and that the ancient scientists were actually there have wrong views, because back then everything was still green and full of water. But he could also see whether there was ever a civilization on Mars and the like. And Radin said, yes, through remote viewing he was actually able to connect with the same entity, namely the light that he had experienced in the near-death experience. And he says, no, that's not God, it's just him in quotation marks, when he's whole, when he's whole, when he's perfect. And then he writes, whenever I look in a mirror today, I think of the light. I know that when I look in the mirror, I only see a small part of my own totality. The person looking back at me from the mirror is the poorest representation of who and what I actually am. I know that beyond this primitive place called physical reality, we may exist in ways that only God could have imagined. If the light is the totality of myself, and not as we currently experience ourselves here, then we have truly slept for a long time. So far for now, the big outlook. I hope you see this as an encouragement not only to take old yoga seriously, but also perhaps to take what a fully conscious person like Jesus Christ did, which is perhaps just a part of the tradition, seriously. And my goal is first to expand the education system. What do we gain if we learn 100,000 pieces of content that may quickly become out of date? What is more important is to learn how our consciousness works. How do we gain access to these skills? How do we bridge this being cut off from our true potential, and that we can then happily use this for each other instead of always being told that? Oh yes, there's nothing we can do. It's getting worse and worse. Because the consequence is that if we concentrate on the thought, it's getting worse and worse, then we make it. And maybe if you have a sick guinea pig or dog, there are now books from many veterinarians. For example, one means that mom is now taking a nap, that the dog, for example, simply takes over the illnesses of the ruler or the mistress bit. A lady had 3 lower jaw operations because of cancerous changes, and the dog had the same shortly afterwards. And after the 3rd operation on this poor dog was over, the woman spontaneously said, "Oh, that's interesting. After the 3rd, it was with me also, over." If we perceive everyday life too superficially, as school education or what the news or television teaches us, we don't notice it. how all these forces are actually currently working, and of course we can do that exactly if we connect as much as possible with our own light-filled wholeness through concentration. Then of course we can also radiate it. And so first try to table with waves or goldfish. That could be the beginning. Thanks.